From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenters this afternoon. Robin Butteroff is a digital conversion specialist in the Serials and Government Publications Division of the Library of Congress. She primarily works on the National Digital Newspaper Program and its website, Chronicling America, which provides free public access to millions of digitized historic U.S. newspaper pages from 1836 to 1922. And Tom Bober serves as the Library of Congress 2015-2016 Teacher in Residence for Audiovisual Materials. A librarian at R.M. Captain Elementary School in Clayton, Missouri, Tom has used a variety of primary sources from the Library of Congress on historical and scientific topics to help students construct knowledge. Thanks to both of you for joining. Take it away.
Great. Thanks for that fantastic introduction, Mike. Just so you could put names to our faces, my name is Robin Butteroff, and I work on Chronicling America, that huge collection of digitized newspapers that Mike was just telling you about. My co-presenter is the fantastic Tom Bober. He's a teacher in residence here at LCE. So what is Chronicling America? Chronicling America is a website that provides free public access to over 10 million pages of historic U.S. newspapers from 1836 to 1922. So 1923 is when copyright starts to get a little complicated. That's why our particular site stops at 1922. If you have any topics that you'd be interested in for this period, like the Titanic or World War I or the roller skating craze of the 19-teens, feel free to toss that over into the chat, and we'll try to talk about it during the session just so you hear about what's interesting to you. So the easiest way to get into the Chronicling America database is just to do a simple keyword search. As you can see here, I typed in the word prohibition, and this is the set of search results that popped up. So one thing to keep in mind with historic newspapers is that you're typically doing keyword searches on optical character recognition text, or OCR text. For those of you who aren't very familiar with OCR, a computer looks at the page image and tries to guess at what words or letters are on the page. It's really good for printed letters. It's not very good for handwritten letters or really tiny letters or squiggly letters. So if you can't, it might not pull up every instance of your keyword on the page. Now Tom is going to tell you about a different way to get into the Chronicling American newspapers.
Yes, another way to search is through special topics in Chronicling America. Special Topics has over 250 different topics in general categories from crimes and trials to natural disasters, from politics to sports, science, and war, and literally hundreds more. If you notice, the screenshot on the right shows what one of those topics page looks like. The important dates can help with searching as well as provide some background information. Suggested search strategies will give you search terms and other tips to conducting your own searches on specific topics. And towards the bottom, sample articles are a good entry point, but not at all the whole of what Chronicling America has to offer on a specific topic. While not in this example, some topics also contain a special section of background information on the event or the time period that the topics page is focused on. This can be helpful when students are using Chronicling America to begin exploring a topic that maybe they know very little about.
So what's behind the website? Chronicling America is a product of the National Digital Newspaper Program, a joint effort by the Library of Congress and the National Endowment for the Humanities and our fantastic local state partners. The states in green are states that currently participate in the program. States in gray have not yet applied for or received a grant from NEH. Personally, I'm a New Jerseyan myself, so I'd love to see those states in gray join the program. And I'm really glad to hear that some of you are interested in suffrage. I'm actually going to talk about that a bit later, and I'll address the African American newspapers question later in the QA too. I have a really long digression on that one for you guys. So just to give a quick recap, there are over 10 million pages that have been digitized from 40 states and territories. That includes Puerto Rico. And this includes content in a number of different languages: French, Italian, German, Spanish, and we actually have some Finnish in there too. So that's enough about Chronicling America. Let's see how we can use some of those 10 million pages in the classroom. This particular ad is part of a primary source set created by the library's teaching team, but it's also really easy to find by searching for the word suffrage. So just to sort of think about this in the classroom, you might just provide this ad to your students and just observe what are some things that you noticed first. And if you guys want to type in some responses into the chat, that would be a great way to sort of get things started. For me, my favorite quote is, "Who would vote if women's suffrage came? Not the mothers, they're too busy to engage in politics." So after you sort of have some initial observations going, you might start to delve into some observing and reflecting, like who created this particular ad? Why did they create it? Who is sort of the audience for this? And I think you can see down at the bottom, this is the Oklahoma Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. I was really curious, so I just Googled it to see what I could find, if anything. And happily enough, the Oklahoma Historical Society had a great article about this group. And I'm not going to completely digress into the article and about this group, but they were mostly campaigning against the suffrage movement and the suffrage amendment, as you can see from this particular ad. And it is relevant that it's an ad too. That's a really interesting type of content in the newspapers. And I think it really provides a different perspective, and it really makes your students start to think about why someone paid money to put their message out there. So sort of moving beyond that, let's look at some of the when and where this particular ad was created. As you can see up here, newspapers are great for this kind of analysis. The time and location are usually right at the top there. As you can see, it's the Tulsa Daily World of Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then November 3rd, 1918. This is up in the folio if you want to get all newspaper nerdy about it. And it's great for your students because it's all on the same page as well. So, let's move beyond just observing things and start thinking about what this time and place means. So what else was going on in November 1918? So I found this particular page and article by just opening up my search to November 1918 and searching for the word suffrage. I didn't limit to Oklahoma, but actually an Oklahoma newspaper is one of the first things that popped up. And you can see that World War I is coming to a close here quite clearly. The Germany is licked to a frazzle. Love that headline. And I think one of my favorite quotes from the ad down at the bottom right, I think it's a little too small for you to read here, but my favorite quote is, "Women were too busy with Red Cross work and other war activities to devote much time to the suffrage cause." And I think it's a really great juxtaposition that doesn't often occur in history textbooks. You'll sort of have the chapter on suffrage, the chapter on sort of history progressing, but this really pulls it all together into the same page, and it really provides a rich context for your students. So the observe and reflect questions on the past couple of slides were inspired by the Teacher's Guide to Analyzing Newspapers. This guide is up on the Library of Congress teachers site, and it's a great way to build out an article, build out a lesson on an article that you're particularly inspired by. I'd also really recommend the one on political cartoons if that's what strikes your fancy, because there are a lot of questions about visual literacy that are much more relevant in a political cartoon sort of analysis. So now I'm going to open this back up and see what are some of the benefits that you find from using newspapers in the classroom, or what are some ways that you would use newspapers in an instructional setting? And I'm going to hand this over to Tom to sort of lead off this conversation.
Thanks, Robin. So like Robin said, we'd love for you to put down into the chat box some ways that you think, beyond the topics, how you might use newspapers in the classroom, or some ideas that maybe you've had about using them. We're going to talk more specifics about those later, and actually while you're doing this, I thought I might just go over some general ideas of ways you can use them, along with some specifics that I've used with students over the years. So one way to use Chronicling America is to take an idea from another primary source and use Chronicling America to go in depth. There are a multitude of resources on one specific topic. There could literally be hundreds of articles, and so you will find an area of depth within Chronicling America that in many cases you won't find anywhere else in the library's collection. I love what Jacob said too, another great way to demonstrate opposing viewpoints. There's definitely going to be different ideas, different perspectives when you have that many resources out there, and so it's another great thing to look at. For example, my students who were doing some research on the Statue of Liberty and looking at the time when it was built were reading about people who were vehemently opposed to building the statue, thinking that it was anti-religious to build a statue that large and that grand that represented liberty. Also, it allows ways to see changes in reaction over time. Staying with that same topic, there are great articles in Chronicling America about how upset people were as the Statue of Liberty began to change in color from what we think as a copper color to that tinted green copper that we see when we look at it today. Advertising and news stories can show what people value. How much do things cost? You compare this with a historic currency calculator, and that can provide even more understanding about information. It's also important to look at whose side was represented in the story, but whose side was not reported on. We've also looked at smaller inquiries, such as the question came up about whether children were really sent through the mail based off some stories that they read out of our library. And they've looked at huge topics such as World War I, although of course they had to learn to search on the Great War in Chronicling America. And with so much information in there, it was overwhelming unless you modify your searches. We'll take a look and talk more about that later. Robin, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great, thanks, Tom. Oh my goodness, and there's so much good stuff going on in the chat. We're definitely going to get to that in the Q&A. So I wanted to talk about another reason why newspapers are a particularly great kind of primary source. And that reason is, they're short, they're brief. The content is super short and accessible, particularly in terms of vocabulary. This makes for a really easy pairing with other newspaper articles or other types of primary sources. As you can see over here, there's a great image from a Philadelphia paper. The image up at the top, this is from a Montana suffrage paper that was published during the Montana State Fair. I think there are only 4 issues of it, and each issue was a fantastic read. The energy was just so great in that particular newspaper. And then at the bottom, we have this paper from Florida with a representative talking about how sentiment appears to be growing in favor of suffrage. And it's just really interesting to sort of put all these things together and have your students be able to read and work with them fairly quickly. Newspapers are also really great for another reason, and that reason is multiple perspectives that I think someone was talking about in the chat, actually. As you can see here, it's that article from the Oklahoma paper before. Then we have this great image off to the left about a headquarters for the Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage over in Pennsylvania as well. And this is actually from the same newspaper page as the image on the earlier slide. So just on the same newspaper page, you'll see opposing viewpoints. This makes for some really easy compare and contrast options for your students. So the breadth of Chronicling America is also really great because it makes a local option possible. If you just want to look at the suffrage site in Montana, you can just focus on Montana. We have plenty in there. I really actually love Montana for suffrage, all things considered. And it really brings it home, the local aspect for your students. You're just not reading about something big happening in Seneca Falls. You're reading about all across the country. Newspapers are also really great for digging deeper. This is another item from the primary source set on suffrage. And while it's a great option on its own, you can see there's not a ton of information about the image. You can tell that it was captured on May 4th, 1912. You can see it's a suffrage parade in New York City, but you don't get a ton of information beyond that. So let's say you take this image, and after your students have sort of looked at it and explored it, pair it with the New York Tribune from the following Monday. And you can see here there's a ton of coverage of the parade. You've got these great cartoons off to the left, this article on the right about the humanizing effect of suffrage, how the parade impressed many senators, and it's just a really great way to easily build out on a particular image that you're inspired by as well. So we talked about all the reasons why newspaper, well, not all of them. I could come up with reasons all day long. But there are a couple of reasons why newspapers can be tricky in the classroom. Some of the reasons that they can be tricky is historic language. As you can see in this example, airplanes were once called aeroplanes. And as Tom was talking about earlier, it was called the Great War rather than World War I. You can see here if students went searching for the word airplane, they wouldn't necessarily find much. In addition to unfamiliar spellings or terms, there can often be difficult or offensive language in the newspapers. And Tom is going to talk a bit more about both of these things.
So one thing that students should be doing when reading newspaper articles is always to be on the lookout for historic language. It will likely not be as obvious as the newspaper headline here, which I happened to run across just when searching aeroplane and airplane. But terms we are familiar with today often accompany terms that have fallen out of favor. As an example, on reading 2 articles on automobiles, I also found the following terms: horseless carriage, electric motor buggy, motor wagon, road wagon, automobile, auto car, and motorcycle. That gives me many, many more searches that I can try and continue to dig deeper. The danger is not running into the information in my mind when my students are searching. The danger is not finding that one additional article that will be a great resource for them and their learning. Remember that recommended topics, and Sherry, thank you for that correction, in Chronicling America also contain search terms and tips, but they themselves are not an exhaustive list. Students are also likely to run across unfamiliar words and phrases found in Chronicling America, and they can be searched right within Chronicling America itself. Context clues within the article can often provide great information. And of course, students can do web searches also to help find that definition. But when they do find definitions, check to make sure that the definitions are from that specific time period, because often we have words, that have changing meanings over time. Offensive language and sensitive topics are definitely present in the 10 million pages of Chronicling America. And while you have some control over what students see if you're selecting the articles, if students are searching, or if the topic you are searching lends itself to offensive language, I would really recommend the 2 blog posts from the Teaching with the Library of Congress blog that can help you address these issues with students. Those 2 blog posts are linked there, and as Mike mentioned earlier, those will be available in the archive of the post as well.
So newspapers are also tricky because it can be difficult to find the really juicy stuff, like political cartoons or photographs. So as I explained earlier, the keyword searches are of the OCR text. And as you can see in this example of the political cartoon on the right, you can see that these 2 fellows are planning their summer vacation based on what counties were still serving alcohol and which parts of the country were not serving alcohol at that point, the wet and the dry counties. And you can see his comment down here, it's all on account of these here suffragettes. And if you were searching for the word suffragette, this particular political cartoon wouldn't come up because he uses sort of a form of the word that's, not the proper spelling, and it's a little handwritten text, so the OCR is probably not going to pick up his word and bring it up if you search for suffragette. So instead, I found this article when I was sort of browsing around, and I just saved it to my personal Tumblr feed because there's so much good stuff going on here. You've got prohibition, you've got the suffragettes. I just knew I would want to use it at some point. You might use a Pinterest board or something else. I've seen a couple of really cool Pinterest boards with stuff like this. So it can also be really hard to find photographs. Has anyone ever heard of dazzle camouflage? It's a kind of camouflage that came around during World War I to make it difficult to accurately target a ship. It's really fun to read about, I have to say. And when I went hunting for dazzle ships in Chronicling America, searching for the word dazzle brought up a ton of dazzling things, which were not ships. And it didn't really bring up as much as I was thinking would come up. And then I realized a lot of the words with dazzle ship included the word camouflage. So I just started searching on the term camouflage to see if I could get something to pop up. And as you can see for this particular image, the caption doesn't include the word dazzle ship, it just includes the word camouflage. And it's really easy to run into this problem with images, as they may have no caption at all, a really short caption, a handwritten caption. So you really have to be curious and willing to refine your search if you want to pursue images of certain things. And Tom is going to talk a little bit more about both of these topics.
So that search for war camouflage is going to result in several images that may be interesting. And so what I like to do when I'm looking at search results like this is to actually search the visual images. Look for those images that catch the eye, that make you want to investigate further. And then look carefully at the captions that accompany those images. Those are going to result, hopefully, in new search terms. Also, I like to look for repeated images. Reading multiple captions of that same image from different newspapers can yield more information about that moment. So if you look at my first two search results in the top row, you'll notice that dazzle ship that Robin shared with us is found in both of those newspapers and actually has two different captions there. One other thing that Robin mentioned is the difficulty of looking and finding information within cartoons. Now, some of these cartoons may be searchable depending on the clarity of the printed word within them and their ability to be recognized by the softwares that they are digitized with. You may want to search within newspapers where you've already found a political cartoon that you like or found engaging. Like Robin mentioned, when you stumble across those, put them aside. You may be using them not immediately, but maybe later in the year or in the following school year. And with so many engaging stories on each page, save links to those pages that contain stories that you can incorporate or that maybe colleagues can incorporate in other units. It's also a wonderful way to show the complex interconnected events of a time period. Now, let's stay with that topic with the event of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that we saw mentioned in that last cartoon to demonstrate another tricky situation: large numbers of search results. Here, a simple search of the San Francisco earthquake yields almost 8,000 results. That's not close to the over 1 million results for Robin's prohibition search earlier, but it's still too many for me or my students to manage. Working with the advanced search can help narrow results, refining the dates of when you want to view the cultural impact of an event, refining your own ideas of the specificity of the event. Both of those things can be helpful, although it may require you to make multiple searches with different specific focuses within the event itself. You might want to think, do you want to see newspapers only from a specific state or even a specific newspaper? You might want to look at how ideas manifested in a certain region or within how they manifested over time within one region or state or newspaper. And don't forget also that there's a checkbox where you can only look at the front page of a newspaper if you just want to see those headlines. When looking at the search results, look at the highlighted text. Does the amount of highlighted text show you how much a story is covered? Can you tell if the search terms are part of a headline, part of an advertisement? Maybe they show up across multiple stories. If you can, read the headlines. look at dates of publication as well as location of publication. And you may see patterns or repeated images for stories that were printed in multiple newspapers.
Great, thanks, Tom. So what happens if you're really excited about all these things, but you aren't really sure where to start, or if you run into a problem? I'd really recommend using our Ask a Librarian feature. This sends a question to our reference librarians, and they're happy to help get you started or find resources that you didn't even know existed. We love seeing these questions come in from teachers because they're always really good and interesting. Another helpful place might be the recommended topics page that Tom was talking about. There's some great ones, like I think someone was interested in the early history of radio, so Marconi, and a related bit, I think people are talking about science. Nikola Tesla is a fun one, the invention of the telephone. There's some really fun ones about electricity and how electricity spread throughout the country, and all the things that weren't electrified before being electrified now. Great ads on that one, by the way. I'll show you one of those at the very end. We also get a ton of questions from National History Day students via the Ask a Librarian service, and we can usually direct them to an already existing topics page. Of course, if we don't have one, we'll be happy to help out with their specific question, but it's always surprising how many topics we've already addressed through these pages. Another great page is the teacher's site with that Analyzing Newspapers Teacher's Guide we were talking about earlier, and the teaching blog with those blog posts about dealing with difficult subjects in primary sources. I love both of those, and it's actually a two-part set. The first one was written, and then so many people responded. There was a follow-up blog post on readers respond to dealing with difficult subjects in the classroom. This is just sort of a quick sum-up link of all of those sites. And then there are some specific things that you might be interested in as well. On the primary source sets, I'd call out the set on women's suffrage. These are all different primary source sets and lesson plans that include content from Chronicling America. The Spanish-American War is fantastic to look at via the newspapers. And those blog posts I was talking about earlier with dealing with difficult subjects, the 12 Years a Slave story is a great one. I love those blog posts. And I'm just going to stop here on a slide of all the different things in Chronicling America, some of my favorite things that I've seen. Up at the top we have the Civil War beginning, Teddy Roosevelt forming the Bull Moose Party, the Titanic sinking. There was a lot of panic about Halley's Comet coming so close to the Earth and the atmosphere incinerating and all sorts of other dire things happening. Lots of sports history, and as I was talking about earlier, the electric revolution, sort of electricity spreading throughout the United States, and the electric car over here. So I can see that there are a ton of questions over in the chat, and I'll just get started with those. So Michael collected a bunch of fantastic ones for us, and the first one I will address is from Vanessa Palmer. And do you have access to African-American owned and operated newspapers? So yes, we do actually have a bunch of African-American newspapers in the Chronicling America database. I'd recommend going to the All Digitized Newspapers tab, which I would show you, but I can't go to the live site via this webinar software. And once you're there, click on All Digitized Newspapers, and there should be a sort for African-American newspapers. I know we just actually added a great newspaper by Frederick Douglass for the Reconstruction period, which I worked on a lot and really, really loved. So that is a fantastic resource to look at. And actually, so I'll read the question and then pass this one over to Tom. This is from Shaquila. What are appropriate topics to teach to elementary age students using newspapers? Do we use current newspapers? Tom?
Thanks, Robin. So I am normally an elementary school librarian, and so really the only limits that you have as far as topics are concerned is your curriculum. When I am working with classroom teachers and working on incorporating primary sources in the classroom, Chronicling America often comes up and as a resource. And finding topics, or if the topic fits with what Chronicling America has to offer, it's going to be great, no holds barred. I will say that we have run into some issues. So for example, I was trying to find the earliest reference I could find in Chronicling America to Paul Bunyan, because we were looking at Tall Tales. And that particular story that was printed in the newspaper, while extremely interesting, had offensive language that the teachers and I were not willing to use with that particular age of students. If the students were a little bit older, we probably would have incorporated it in and talked about that offensive language and how we deal with it as historians. But given the background that those students had, we chose not to. The other thing that you'll want to take into consideration is simply how much text you're giving them. And so Robin did mention that these particular, often the articles are short. You will sometimes find articles that are literally a page long. They're quite hefty, and so you want to steer maybe away from those with certain ages of students. But what I've also done sometimes is when the article itself is too hefty, we look at the illustrations, the photos, the headlines, and those can be analyzed as well and are much more available and accessible to younger students. And Robin, do we have another question?
We do indeed. There's another really good one.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Robin.
Oh yeah, I'll tackle Rich's question about describing technological changes by decade, especially the use of images. So I'm not sure if you're referring to general technological changes or changes in newspaper printing technology. I will say a lot of people are surprised when they start looking at the older newspapers about what you find in terms of the headline or things that we sort of consider common in newspapers hadn't been invented yet. One of my favorites is the weather column. I think I found the first national weather column when they started sending forth things back and forth by, I would say the telegram, and it was very cool. So the weather column was invented. There weren't really headlines early in the day. They would be much smaller. So if you're looking for a headline about the Civil War, it's probably going to be fairly restrained compared to what you would expect. The extra over here is about as big as it will get. But there are other things that they would use in newspapers as well. They had something called morning bars. So outside of the column, there would be a black border around any notification or funeral notice. So if you look at the newspapers around the death of Lincoln, you'll see this weird black border around all of the columns on the page, because that was how they would typically report on death notices. So a lot of things changed in the newspapers, and images really started to play a role in, I want to say, after 1900. There was some before then, but that's when they really started to get going. The newspapers around World War I would have these fantastic rotogravure sections. So there would just be like 4 to 8 pages of just images pulled from World War I scenes and other common things happening in the U.S. So there was a lot of evolution in what a newspaper is over the period that you can see in Chronicling America. So I'm not sure if that was quite your question, but there was a lot of interesting stuff packed in there. And I'll hand it over to Mike for a second. I think he said there were some more questions.
Yes, Rich had another one. Will Chronicling America ever add any more recent papers? I'm assuming he means post 822. Yeah,
so with copyright being what it is, it's very complicated, and newspapers are even more complex objects in that they are compilations of things pulled from, the Associated Press, images from staff reporters, ads. Different people might own the different copyright aspects of different parts of the papers, or like a cartoonist might have kept the copyright to his particular things. So after 1922, things do get very complicated. That said, there are a ton of companies like New York Times, Washington Post that have digitized their archives and are often available as subscription resources through your local public or academic library that you might want to explore. I know there are tons of juicy things happening in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s that people would love to look at, but that's why we're sticking to 1922 with our database.
Cool. Here's another question and they're really pouring in here. So Jacob asks, are there tags associated with all the papers, or are we just searching the papers, the text themselves?
So you'll just be searching the text of the newspapers themselves. We don't really have tags like you would see on Flickr or something, but we do have pages that we've pushed to Flickr. We have a Pinterest board from LC Now, and I think you can tag those with tags if you want to save certain things.
From Sarah, she asks, how easy do you think items like music reviews could be found in catalog newspapers?
Ooh, I can say this, and very good. This is a really good thing if you want to research. It depends on what kind of music reviews you're looking for, but yes, music reviews are definitely in there. I think we have a page or two we have a recommended topics page on Sister Etta Jones, which was a famous opera singer, and there are a lot of other really interesting bits of musical history in there. A lot of the premieres were in Europe for certain kinds of music, so it will be sort of secondary reporting, but yes, there's a lot in terms of music reviews.
Down the list, I'm giving them to you in the order they were received, but Sherry asks how the recommended topics were chosen because she thinks the articles are so well chosen.
Well, there's a pretty good reason for that. The recommended topics pages are created by someone thinking that the recommended topics page needs to exist here at the library staff. So someone will be like, oh, I can't believe we don't have a topics page on X, and then we'll just go and write a page on X. So there are people who are really enthusiastic about the topic. I really got excited about the Pure Food and Drug Act, and which is a great one as Halloween is around the corner, but pretty much the Pure Food and Drug Act made sure that, you know, cyanide wasn't in candy and lots of other food and health safety regulations that I really, really, really enjoyed. I'd really recommend you reading it because I think it's a lot of fun, and it involves a story about a doctor and his poison squad, which is always a great way to start.
From Jason, does anybody have any ideas how to incorporate newspapers into physical education classroom?
I'm going to hand this one over to Tom.
Oh, Robin, I'm chuckling. That is a tough one. I think the place where it might be interesting would be to look at kind of exercise crazes of the day. I'm not really well versed enough to know what some of those may be. I'd probably have to go out and do some searches, and some other people may be putting some in. Oh, health issues, definitely, Dana. Thank you for that. But looking at what were the exercises of the day, what were people doing for physical activity of the day, I think can be fascinating because those things change and they morph and they turn into new things.
I'm totally going to chime in. I like where you went with that. Yeah, there's this great ping pong craze. We have a recommended topics page on that. We have one on the roller coaster craze, which I mentioned. And there are some great, really interesting ideas of what physical education was, and actually dance, now that I'm thinking of it too, the modern dance movement. There's a particular dancer whose name is escaping me, but there's a ton of great information on dance, what suitable exercises were for good posture, and it might be really interesting from that perspective. You could actually do some of the physical exercises they recommend in the newspapers, which would be okay. In most cases, some of them might be not very healthy for you, though.
I want to jump in one thing and add just one more layer to this. Rich here puts some information about the changes in rules and purposes of sports. There's some wonderful articles about football during that time period because of how dangerous it was, and partially because of the play, partially because of the equipment, and changes that were put into place because of that. So that time period is really ripe with football if you're interested in that. And actually, next week on the Teaching with the Library of Congress blog, our other teacher in residence, Trey Smith, is going to be posting up putting up a blog post that will also contain some resources from Chronicling America.
Ooh, and I love that bit about Kellogg starting his cereal company too. The history around that is fascinating, and yeah, you'll see a lot of great food ads in Chronicling America as well for things that are still around today, from Wrigley's to varieties of beer, Wrigley's gum to varieties of beer. So there are some really, really fascinating ones. We just did a blog post, I think, on the main LC blog page about coffee. Whiskey is also supposed to be the cure if you're feeling summer tired, which we didn't know that being summer tired was a problem until we started finding ads for this particular kind of whiskey. So yeah, if you're interested in food history, Chronicling America is one interesting place. The history of pastas, actually, too, just what's considered macaroni, how you cook pasta. Yeah, we all love the food things a lot in Chronicling America.
Go ahead and jump in real quick if I could, Mike, if that's okay, and address something that came up way early in the chat window, and that was the idea of anniversaries of special events. Some people mentioned that they were interested in looking at the American Revolution, for example, and with Chronicling America only covering 1836 through 1922, you're not going to get the actual events of the American Revolution as primary sources. But what we can look at is how people from 1836 through 1922 viewed those individuals, viewed those events, and how those views changed over time. I've done a little bit of research for a fifth grade teacher who's doing some work specifically with that with her students, and looking at George Washington and how he was viewed and how he was essentially kind of the mythology of George Washington and how it shows itself in newspapers over decades. And it is fascinating. So even if you are studying earlier time periods, Chronicling America may still have some avenues for you to incorporate some of their content into your teaching.
Yes, I'd say that for the Civil War too. There were a lot of reunions of Civil War soldiers 50 years afterwards, and it was really interesting to read stories about Civil War veterans going back to where they had fought, and the sort of remembrances associated with that. I'm also seeing a question from Jamie about if musical events were advertised in newspapers. And yeah, there are plenty of advertisements for musical events in newspapers. There were also a bunch about movies too. There are some really great sections about movies and movie premieres in the 19-teens and 1920 to 22 that provide a really interesting view into cinematic history. There was another tangent I was going to go on, but I think I've lost that tangent.
Robin and Tom, do you have any kind of final ideas for the good of the cause before we wrap it up?
I'll jump in with one more thing as I was making notes and watching that chat go by from earlier, and kind of goes along with what Robin was mentioning at the beginning of the presentation with all the great resources on women's suffrage. Someone mentioned looking at ideas related to sexism and racism, and just to note that while at times you may find specific stories that directly deal with those events, also looking at stories that show who is not represented in the news, who's not being talked about, who's kind of being ignored or underreported, can also give some support to those ideas behind sexism and racism. That is another avenue that you may want to look towards. So that was just one additional little note that I had written down I wanted to throw in. And Robin, I'm handing it off to you.
Ooh, this feels important, the final word. Newspapers, they're really great for so many different things. Every time I start poking around in there, I find another 6 things that I totally love, and then I have to go write a topics page on it. But yeah, I think we've chatted about a lot of the things that I love, so I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, Robin and Tom, that was an awesome presentation. Thank you so much, and big time kudos to everybody in the chat room too. That was the chat was really beneficial as well, and going crazy. So anyway, thanks everybody for being here. Would like to invite you at this time to look at the screen and click the survey link and provide feedback on this session. It's very valuable to us. Again, thanks very much for joining us, and hope everybody has a good evening. Bye-bye.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.